Have you ever wondered what turns a simple promise into a contract that you can actually enforce in court? Well, it almost always comes down to one single powerful idea. And today, we are going to pull back the curtain on that concept: consideration. So let's start with a simple scenario. Imagine you tell a friend, hey, I'll give you $100. It's a nice thing to say, right? But what if you change your mind? Can they actually sue you to get that money? In the eyes of the law, probably not. And that's because your promise is missing something essential: a price. Not a price in dollars and cents necessarily, but a legal price. And that's exactly what consideration is. Let's dig in. All right, to make sure we cover all the bases, especially if you've got exams on the horizon, here's our game plan. First up, we'll define what consideration actually is. Then, we'll get into the nitty-gritty, the rules that say whether consideration is valid or not. After that, we'll ask who can actually sue on a contract. And then we'll look at the really interesting exceptions, when a promise can be binding even without consideration. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with the one thing you absolutely need to remember. Okay, let's get right to it. What on earth is this thing called consideration? You can think of it as the what's in it for me part of any deal. It's the legal system's way of asking, was this a real bargain or just a one-sided promise? The classic legal phrase for this is quid pro quo, something for something. Consideration is the price you pay to make someone else's promise enforceable. Without it, you just have what's called a gratuitous promise. There's another old Latin term you might see, nudum pactum, which literally means a naked promise. And a promise that's naked, with nothing given in return for it, just isn't something a court can enforce. And this is not a new idea by any means. We're talking centuries of legal thought here. The famous jurist Blackstone put it pretty simply. He called it the recompense given by one party to the other. Basically, it's the benefit, the detriment, the thing of value that proves a real deal was made. Okay, so we've established we need consideration. But what actually counts? I mean, can it be just anything? Nope. The law is very specific, so let's go through the essential rules. Think of this next part as your checklist for building a rock-solid contract. So here are the 5 big rules we have to tick off. Number 1, the act has to be done because the promiser asked for it. 2, the value can actually come from the person getting the promise or from someone else entirely. 3, the timing is flexible. It can be in the past, present, or future. 4, it has to have some kind of real legal value. And 5, and this is the one that always gets people, it doesn't have to be a fair trade. Let's break each of these down. So rule 1 is absolutely key. You can't just do something nice for someone out of the blue and then demand they pay you for it. The action that serves as consideration has to be done at the request of the person making the promise. So picture this. Your neighbor's house is on fire. You heroically grab a hose and help put it out. You can't then turn around and send them a bill for your time. Why not? Because they never asked you to do it. It was a wonderful, voluntary act, but it wasn't part of a bargain. Now for a rule that trips up a lot of students. You'd think the person who benefits from a promise has to be the one to provide the consideration, right? Well, not necessarily. The price can be paid by a total third party. The case that really explains this is Ch-3 v. Ramaya. Here's the story. A mother gave some property to her daughter, but there was a condition. The daughter had to promise to pay a yearly sum to her uncle. The daughter paid for a while, then stopped. Her defense? My uncle never gave me anything. There was no consideration from him. But the court said, doesn't matter. The mother's gift of the property was the consideration, and it made the daughter's promise to the uncle legally binding. Okay, what about timing? Present consideration is the easiest. Think of a cash sale. You hand over the money, you get the coffee. It happens at the same time. Future consideration is also pretty straightforward. It's a promise for a promise. I promise to paint your house next month. You promise to pay me when I'm done. But past consideration, that's the tricky one. This is when a promise is made because of something that's already happened. The only way this is valid is if that past act was done at the promiser's request in the first place. Rule 4 is all about substance. The consideration has to be something real in the eyes of the law. So you can't promise something physically impossible, like, I'll pay you $1,000 to discover treasure using magic. It also can't be illegal, obviously. And it can't be too vague, like a promise to pay what I think is right. And finally, it can't be illusory. Now, this is a big one. An illusory promise is where you're not actually giving up anything new. For example, a firefighter can't demand a reward for putting out a fire. That's already their job. Promising to do something you already have a legal duty to do, that's not valid consideration. And that leads us perfectly into Rule 5, which is my favorite, The peppercorn theory. The law says consideration must be sufficient, meaning it must exist, but it does not have to be adequate. As long as a bargain was made, the courts really don't care if you made a good deal or a bad one. You could literally sell a mansion for a single peppercorn, and as long as both parties agree, that's a valid contract. Why? Because it's not the court's job to save people from bad bargains. Just one word of caution. If a deal is so lopsided it's shocking, a court might look closer to see if there is any fraud or coercion involved. So, we know what a valid contract looks like. We've gone through our checklist. But that brings up the next big question. Okay, we had a contract. Who actually gets to enforce it? Who can walk into a courtroom and sue if something goes wrong? This leads us to another core legal doctrine.
The main rule here is called privity of contract, and it's pretty simple and strict. Only the people who are actual parties to the contract can sue on it. If you're a stranger to the contract, even if you stand to benefit from it, you have no legal standing. The famous case here is Dunlop Tire Co. versus Selfridge. Long story short, Dunlop had a deal with a distributor about a minimum price for their tires. The distributor then made a similar deal with a retailer, Selfridge. When Selfridge broke the price agreement, Dunlop tried to sue them directly, but the court said no. Dunlop and Selfridge didn't have a contract with each other. They were strangers.
But, of course, the law loves exceptions, and there are some really important escape hatches from the strict privity rule that you absolutely need to know. For example, if a contract creates a trust, the beneficiary, the person who benefits from the trust, can sue. Or if one party acknowledges their liability to a third party, that can create a right to sue. And of course, there are cases involving an agent acting for someone else, or when a contract is formally assigned to a new person. These are the loopholes that allow a stranger to get involved. All right, get ready for a twist. We've spent all this time hammering home that consideration is the absolute foundation of a contract. No consideration, no contract. But what if I told you there are a few special situations where a promise is legally binding with zero consideration? Let's look at when the biggest rule of all gets broken. So on one hand, we have the ironclad rule. An agreement without consideration is void. It's nothing. But on the other hand, the law is practical. It understands that human relationships are complicated, and it carves out a few very specific exceptions where a promise can stand on its own. So this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? When does the law step in and say, you know what, in this specific case, even without a quid pro quo, this promise must be kept? Let's run through the list. Think of this table as your ultimate cheat sheet for the exceptions. First, natural love and affection. A promise made between close family members can be valid, but there are strict conditions. It has to be in writing, and it has to be formally registered. Second, past voluntary service. Let's go back to our house fire example. If your neighbor, so grateful that you helped them, later promises in writing to pay you for your help, that promise is binding. Third, a time-barred debt. If a debt is so old you can't sue for it anymore, but the debtor gives you a fresh, written promise to pay it, that promise is enforceable. And finally, simple things like a completed gift, once it's given and accepted, you can't take it back, and creating an agency relationship don't need consideration. Whew, okay, we have covered a lot of ground here. The definition, the rules, who can sue, and the exceptions. So let's zoom out and lock in the single most important idea from all of this. Here it is, the big takeaway. Consideration is the dividing line. It's what transforms a casual, I promise, into a serious, legally binding contract that a judge will uphold. Understanding its rules, and just as crucially, knowing when those rules don't apply, is the absolute key to mastering contract law. And that leaves us with one final thought. The whole idea of consideration came from a time of handshakes and face-to-face deals. But today, we live in a world of one-click agreements, smart contracts, and global digital transactions. So, is this centuries-old idea of a price for a promise still the right tool for the job? That's a huge question that courts and lawyers are grappling with every single day. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.